Welcome to episode 115 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue our review of Epicurus's letter to Herodotus, and we move further into fundamental physics and discuss some basic epistemology problems. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
Moreover, the universe is bodies and space. For that bodies exist, sense itself witnesses in the experience of all men. And in accordance with the evidence of sense, we must of necessity judge of the imperceptible by reasoning, as I have already said. And if there were not that which we term void and place and intangible existence, bodies would have nowhere to exist and nothing from which to move, as they are seen to move. And besides these two, nothing can even be thought of either by conception or on the analogy of things conceivable, such as could be grasped as whole existences and not spoken of as the accidents or properties of such existences. Furthermore, among bodies some are compounds and others those of which compounds are formed. And these latter are indivisible and unalterable, if, that is, all things are not to be destroyed into the non-existent, but something permanent is to remain behind at the dissolution of compounds. They are completely solid in nature and can by no means be dissolved in any part. So it must needs be that the first beginnings are indivisible corporeal existence. Moreover, the universe is boundless. For that which is bounded has an extreme point, and the extreme point is seen against something else. So that as it has no extreme point, it has no limit, and as it has no limit, it must be boundless and not bounded. Furthermore, the infinite is boundless both in the number of the bodies and in the extent of the void. For if on the one hand the void were boundless and the bodies limited in number, the bodies could not stay anywhere, but would be carried about and scattered through the infinite void, not having other bodies to support them and keep them in place by means of collisions. But if, on the other hand, the void were limited, the infinite bodies would not have room wherein to take their place. Besides this, the indivisible and solid bodies, out of which two the compounds are created and into which they are dissolved, have an incomprehensible number of varieties in shape. For it is not possible that such great varieties of things should arise from the same atomic shapes if they are limited in number. And so in each shape the atoms are quite infinite in number, but the differences of shape are not quite infinite, but only incomprehensible in number. And the atoms move continuously for all time, some of them falling straight down, others swerving, and others recoiling from their collisions. And of the latter, some are borne on, separating to a long distance from one another, while others again recoil and recoil whenever they chance to be checked by the interlacing with others, or else shut in by atoms interlaced around them. For on the one hand, the nature of the void which separates each atom by itself brings this about, as it is not able to afford resistance, and on the other hand, the hardness which belongs to the atoms makes them recoil after collision to as great a distance as the interlacing permits separation after the collision. And these motions have no beginning, since the atoms in the void are the cause. These brief sayings, if all these points are borne in mind, afford a sufficient outline for our understanding of the nature of existing things.
Martin, thank you for reading that for us today. Anyone who's following along and listening to the podcast sequentially is going to have heard this section read several times, and that's probably a good thing rather than a bad thing, because Epicurus is saying in line 45 that these brief sayings afford a sufficient outline for our understanding of the nature of existing things. So again, this is a particularly important list of principles for Epicurean philosophy. Part of the reason we've continued to read them each week is that we haven't made as much progress in going through them as quickly as perhaps we might have liked. And we'll see how that goes today as well, because there's some material here in the first several passages that I think really deserve us lingering over. we've continued to do, I think, a pretty good job of not really spending all the time talking about how what is being said here comports with modern physics and the latest discoveries in physics. We've attempted to talk about the implications of these principles as Epicurus would have seen them and get into the meat of how Epicurus was using them himself, since he was primarily looking at teaching people how to live happily and not teaching people how to be the best astrophysicists they could possibly be. And so in these opening sections, there's some material that we'll spend some time on. And the very first one, in fact, this very first sentence, moreover, the universe is bodies in space. And here's the part I think is more important even than that. For that bodies exist, sense itself witnesses in the experience of all men. And in accordance with the evidence of the sense, we must of necessity judge of the imperceptible by reasoning, as I have already said. So the point we should talk about here for a few minutes is, again, not so much the conclusion that everything is made of atoms and void, but how he reached this conclusion, because he's stating the basis for it. And he's stating that that basis is sensation itself in the experience of all men. And then he's going to make a point about how important it is for us to have confidence in that. The basic point being that even though we can't see atoms or touch them, sense itself is the witness in the experience of everyone that bodies exist. So we probably ought to talk about what's the difference between atom and body, because he's not referring to atoms here, he's referring to bodies.
Yeah, because bodies is what we perceive. So that one, then he can directly refer them. So to the atoms he comes later.
Bodies being what, Martin? Everything that's made up of atoms?
What we can see and what we can feel with touch.
So anything that has mass would be maybe a way to put that. Martin, how do you feel about what I've just said?
Yeah. So in modern physics, we would call it like everything what has mass would fall under this Epicurean definition of bodies. That would be mass in a generalized sense, because photons don't exist at rest and they don't have rest mass. So, but when they exist, they move with the speed of light, and this condition they have a mass.
So generally speaking, bodies are atoms, and every collection of atoms, when they come together to form other things. But at the root of everything in the Epicurean sense is atoms. And it's atoms and void, but it's the atoms that make up the bodies.
Yes. But he doesn't say this in the first paragraph yet. So here he stays closer to the sensation. So what we perceive are not individual atoms, but what is made of them.
Yeah, let me just repeat that. Again, the word apparently that is being used here is not atom. It would be nice to know what the Greek word was if we had done here. But he says, for that bodies exist, sense itself witnesses. So whatever it is he's talking about is something that is perceptible to the senses. And whether he's already said it or whether he's going to say it, we've pretty much acknowledged that atoms themselves in their individual existences are not perceptible to the senses. So in this part of his reasoning process, he's talking about those things which our senses can perceive. And he's explicitly linking it to the experience of all men. Sense itself witnesses in the experience of all men. So he seems to me to be making a pretty broad generalization here that our senses are sufficient for us to determine that something out there exists in the universe. And then he says, and in accordance with the evidence of sense, we must of necessity judge of the imperceptible by reasoning. So again, this is a chain argument, as DeWitt might say, and he's providing not only the evidence, but also the reasoning process by which he deems that evidence to be reliable. What other possibilities are there for judging of the imperceptible besides the evidence of sense? This is a pretty basic point, but probably worth making. Joshua, what other options are there?
Well, that is essentially the option, because we cannot perceive, by definition, of that which is imperceptible. The only method we have to really get at it is by observing things that are perceptible and determining to what extent things which are imperceptible are analogous to things that are perceptible, or determining how we can reason to the nature of things that are imperceptible from reasoning about things that are perceptible. there wouldn't be another way to go about it.
Well, the reason I'm asking that question is, of course, this letter is written as sort of a summary of the philosophy to a student, but we don't really know exactly what level of achievement that Herodotus himself had made in understanding Epicurean philosophy. But if he's talking to some new student in Athens, what other possibilities will a student have heard if he's been going around, such as in a few days in Athens, from school to school? What are the other competing possibilities that other philosophers would say should be used instead of the evidence of sense?
Well, I think in this, as in most things, you've got a variety of competing philosophical views or worldviews even that people would use to parse information. And one of those things would be arguing from pure mathematics and the logic of pure mathematics.
The Pythagoreans probably would do that.
Yeah. Of course, Plato spent quite a lot of time talking about things that were imperceptible. My understanding is that his ideal forms, the world of ideal forms, was imperceptible.
But what was his source of knowledge about those?
Well,
Reason.
That's the challenging question, isn't it?
Yeah. Reasoning about them, so that, but in the end, I mean, we can see this as a variant of this approach, because in the end, even Plato has to come down what is in the real world. And he said what the real world, what we see is just illusion. But behind there are these ideal forms. And by reasoning, he can come up with the ideal forms which would then be behind those illusions.
But Martin, right here in this sense we've been reading, Epicurus himself says that we must of necessity judge of the imperceptible by reasoning. So how's that different than Plato?
The big difference is that Epicurus puts more emphasis on our perception, so and our sensation, so that he gives a higher level of reality than Plato admits to them.
What if somebody said to you that it's totally different? Plato has undercut the senses and said that the senses are not sufficient for reliable reasoning, and that the senses are in fact so deceptive that they should be thrown out as indicia of reliable reasoning. And is that not Aristotle's position as well? Is that not what led Pyrrho to his conclusion that there was no reliable method of reaching a conclusion, because they all attacked and undermined and threw out the reliability of the senses? Okay, Joshua, time for you.
I think that in the case of Plato in particular, slightly complicating the issue is that the imperceptible, I think in Epicurean philosophy, it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. I think that you could kill your own mother, for example, and still be able to reason about things that were imperceptible. So I'm not saying that you should, or that Epicurus would say that you should. The point I'm trying to make is that in Plato's world, the attainment of virtue is, I think, instrumental in attaining any understanding of what he thought to be imperceptible, which is his world of ideal forms. Not just everybody is going to do this. Not everybody can, I think, is my understanding of how Plato approached this thing.
This is a big difference. That he was far more elitistic in that sense.
Right.
Elitist. He was far more elitist.
Right. And actually, I have a different quote, which we think is from Epicurus here. This is Vatican Sayings number 29. He says, "To speak frankly, as I study nature, I would prefer to speak in oracles, that which is of advantage to all men, even though it be understood by none, rather than to conform to popular opinion, and thus gain the constant praise that comes from the many." So Epicurus here is saying that he is going to approach nature with the view that she can be understood, and that she can be understood in essentially all her particulars, and can be explained to people, and not just to people, but to all men, to all men and women. So the idea that there's a realm of higher knowledge that is cordoned off only for the wise, that it's not consonant with Epicurean philosophy. And it starts right here with atomism and void.
Okay, now, Joshua, what you've just said, I think, is something that we pretty much are all agreeing on, that Epicurus held that knowledge is possible. So summarize the point. What's the difference between Epicurus and Plato?
Well, I think part of the difference is that whether or not the world is explicable for Epicurus depends merely on your ability to look at the facts dispassionately and to reason from the perceptible to the imperceptible, but restraining yourself from going too far. Epicurus is not going to reason his way to supernatural creator God, because that would be something that's imperceptible. But he's not going to start with the perceptible and reason his way there, because at that point you're just essentially making stuff up, aren't you?
And how would Plato object to Epicurus's perspective?
Well, I think that Plato had the view quite different from Epicurus, that not only are people not going to approach to an understanding of the way things really are, but the whole world that we see is actually false to the way things really are. You're looking at the dream, you're not looking at real life, and that there's only a select few people who are ever going to or ever could, because somehow character matters in this equation.
What's the point of the cave analogy to Plato?
What's the point of the cave analogy?
Yes. What is the takeaway point of the elaborate discussion of how all we really can see is shadows flickering on the wall?
The idea there is that we are dreaming the dream of waking life, where there's some other purer world of ideal forms that we can't see, and that it takes a certain kind of spiritual insight to see. And
yeah, I'm not trying to belabor this too much, but I've always thought, and I pretty much still think, that the big issue here is the question of how much we can rely on our senses. I thought that Plato's cave analogy was intended to display that our attempts to use our senses to determine truth is doomed to failure, because the senses are ultimately insufficient to allow us to come into contact with truth or to determine what truth is, and that something more than our senses is needed for determining what truth is. It sounds to me like we have a difference of opinion a little bit among the three of us about how much of that distinction between Epicurus and Plato is grounded in the reliability of the senses. I think there's more for us to discuss here in terms of what is the difference between Plato's and Epicurus's approach. Another way of asking the question, when Epicurus says, in accordance with the evidence of sense, we must of necessity judge of the imperceptible by reasoning. Would Plato or Aristotle even agree with that sentence?
Maybe not the way this is formulated, but in the end, both of them need to come up with their ideal forms or whatever they else refer to in a way that they can explain the illusions.
So they use reasoning, is what you're saying, but how willing are they to tie their reasoning to the evidence of sensation?
They are only required as much as in the end they can explain with these ideal forms the illusions. So that is the only thing, whereas Epicurus takes the sensations more serious and makes the whole concept behind it closer to the sensations than Plato would feel compelled to.
Joshua?
Yeah, I think it's the case that Plato is not relying so much on the senses. Of course, there was that famous inscription right over the door to the academy that said, "Let none who have not studied geometry enter here." The implication, not only of that, but of his broader work, seems to have been that in seeing the way that in geometry you can start with an axiom or a proposition and reason your way to new information without any sensory input at all. Geometry does not require sensory input. You just have to start with definitions. 2 points make a line, for example. That would be an example of a definition. And from there, you can reason your way to postulates, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And at no point in the process do you ever have to do something as filthy as get involved in the world of the base senses. So the general idea, he distinguishes Plato between the phenomenon of a thing, which is the illusion, and then the ideal form of the thing. But sense perception is not a vehicle for getting from one to the other.
In Plato's view.
In Plato's view. And in the view, by the way, of the Roman Catholic Church in the Renaissance. Because interestingly, Giordano Bruno, who was executed burned at the stake in the Campo di Fiore in Rome by the Cardinal Bellarmino, among the many charges that were leveled against him, one of the charges was his lack of orthodoxy on the Eucharist, and in particular, the Catholic doctrine of the transubstantiation of the Eucharist. The Vatican, or the prosecutors of the Vatican, held the view that if the universe is made of atoms and void, and nothing else, then the bread at the Eucharist and the wine are made of things that are not bread and are not wine, because there's no bread atoms, right? There's no wine atoms. It's just bread is made of atoms, wine is made of atoms, but it's the same atoms that everything else is made of. And so the argument that they made was, if there's no bread, in other words, if there are no bread atoms in the bread, if the bread is already something else, then it can't be, by the act of transubstantiation, it can't be transformed into the flesh of Jesus Christ, because it's already not bread. And so one of the reasons, not the only reason certainly, but one of the reasons that he was burned at the stake was for atomism, because the idea that the universe is explicable to people of ordinary sense is not something that the Catholic hierarchy was prepared to accept. Have I made all that clear?
Joshua, that is a fascinating story, and I think that is directly applicable to what we're talking about. I don't think I've ever read that before. Is there a particular source that you would suggest, or is that just from your Catholic background? Or
well, the Vatican has records of the trial, and I should point out that there are various interpretations of the trial of Giordano Bruno, which went on for quite some time, and these various interpretations are occasionally in conflict. And sometimes it's the case that the Catholic Church will say that, no, he was executed for this reason, not for this reason. But when you read these documents, the charge of atomism was plainly made. But as always, I will attempt in the show notes for this episode to provide a source for that claim.
Well, that's exactly what I was about to say, is to refer to the show notes here and remind everybody who's listening to these podcasts that we are attempting to discuss the material in a way that will spur interest and spur the motivation of everybody to dig more into them themselves. I have always thought that these epistemology issues are some of the least well-developed parts of Epicurean philosophy in our normal discussions. And I know even after years of attempting to do better at it, I am far myself from being where I need to be in terms of being able to articulate this. I think that this issue of the role of sense perception is critically important in understanding Epicurean epistemology and in explaining to people how he differs certainly from Plato and Pythagoras and probably even from Aristotle as well. And yet it's not easy to do this. I can't even point to some very clear statement of Plato on what his view is on this subject, or Aristotle on what his view is. And these positions by Epicurus, without being able to line them up against each other very clearly, it's hard to bring them down into understandable form. Everybody who's read anything about Epicurus has read that Epicurus supposedly said that all sensations are true, and they know that Epicurus stresses sensation. And so most people have a sense that the role of sense perception is very important to Epicurus, but unless they can distinguish how that differs from Aristotle and Plato and the other Greek philosophers, unless they have a position on that, they're not going to be able to get much further in understanding Epicurean epistemology, I would assert. So we're not going to be able to resolve today either what the best way of understanding this is, but it does seem to be something that's very important. And for somebody who wants to really develop their understanding of Epicurean philosophy, it's something that would be worth a lot more time probably to understand. And hopefully in the future, as we work on the Epicurean Friends Forum and different things that we do, we can attempt to develop this even further so that people can understand it and not have to just ramble through it to some extent like I am right now. But it's a point that does come up over and over again. Go ahead, Joshua.
Well, let me just bring in one more of the Vatican sayings. And
okay.
I have to give the usual disclaimer here that we don't actually know that all of these were written by Epicurus himself, but it certainly seems to dovetail with what we're talking about here. This is number 45. The study of nature, which is what we're trying to do here, does not create men who are fond of boasting and chattering, or who show off the culture that impresses the many, but rather men who are strong and self-sufficient and who take pride in their own personal qualities, not in those that depend on external circumstances. So while the end of that saying is a little more difficult to apply to what we've been talking about here, I think it does apply, because What he's saying here, it's kind of sort of what I said at the beginning, which was it doesn't matter what kind of person you are. You could be the worst person there is, and still you could study nature, and still you could come to something approximating the way things really are. You can come to a real understanding of how nature works and not be a good person and not be virtuous and not be wise. You don't have to be those things because the evidence that you need is all around you. You just have to pay attention to it. Whereas if you take the Platonic view that there's a world of ideal forms and some people are going to only ever see the false and illusory phenomenon of things, that you're one of the elect and you're going to look through the phenomenon and to penetrate into this world of ideal forms, which is something that is selected only for the few and the rare. Only really for the philosopher, that is to say, the lover of wisdom. But you don't have to be a philosopher to understand or to penetrate the physical world of the Epicurean universe. It doesn't take a great deal of learning to understand how these things work because you're not being sold a bill of goods.
Joshua, let me bounce off of what you've just said there. At some point today, I was going to work this in, and this is a good place to work it in. There's a parallel to the passage that we're reading here about sense itself, witnesses, and the experience of all men. There's a parallel, and maybe it's even exact, in Lucretius Book 1, line 418, which reads, quote, "For that body exists is declared by the feeling which all share alike." And it's that all share alike that brought that to mind right then, because you're talking about how all men have this kind of reasoning available to them just by using their senses. But Lucretius put it in this way: "For that body exists is declared by the feeling which all share alike. And unless faith in this feeling be firmly grounded at once and prevail, there will be nothing to which we can make appeal about things hidden, so as to prove anything by the reasoning of the mind." So again, Lucretius is expanding a little bit on what Epicurus has said and says, unless faith in this feeling be firmly grounded at once and prevail. So that's probably what we're talking about here. Not only the fact that all men have access to this information and all share it alike, but the importance of it is that they must be able to firmly ground it at once and prevail, is the way this is saying. Because if we can't firmly ground the conclusions we reach about bodies that are in front of us, there's nothing to which we can appeal to make arguments about things which can only be reasoned about because we have no evidence about it. And actually, I'm not going to read the whole thing again, but that takes me back to the quote from Torquatus we have at the top of the forum right now about how the constitution of the world has to be thoroughly understood before you can justify the verdict of your senses. So I think that these are the issues that we're talking about here that everybody has to explore for themselves and come to see to what extent it's important to them. So maybe we should go past the first sentence of our material today, unless if we're going to, again, continue to blaze through this. So 40 is the next section, and he's talking about the fact that there must also be a void, because we can touch and see bodies, but we can't see void. I guess void might even be the first example of something that's imperceptible that we're going to attempt to establish through reasoning. Because he says that if void did not exist, bodies would have nowhere to exist and nothing through which to move as they are seen to move. So what do we want to say about the void?
Well, what you get in Lucretius that you don't get here is you get all of the counter arguments to the Epicurean position. And the argument against void is predicated on the idea that movement or motion is possible in a world without empty space. Because we've all heard that phrase, right, that nature abhors a vacuum. The proposal was that if there is no void and matter is just crammed together with no empty space in between, then it makes motion impossible. Certainly that would have been the Epicurean position. But people said, oh no, you can still move. The things in front of you will just move out of the way and push things back and then fill in the empty space behind you. I shouldn't say empty space. There is no empty space behind you as you leave. So void exists in the Epicurean cosmology in part because it allows for motion, which otherwise reasonably would seem to be impossible.
Joshua, let's stay with that for just a minute. When you say it allows for motion, I think the very next sentence is important on what else it allows us to conclude. Do you have that in front of you? Are you looking at line 40 where it says, and besides these two?
Nothing can even be thought of either by conception or on the analogy of things conceivable, such as could be grasped as whole existences and not spoken of as the accidents, or I think the word you prefer, Cassius, is events, and not be spoken of as the accidents or properties of such existences.
Let's stay with that because that's a very interesting sentence and has lots of implications to it. But the reason I wanted to focus on it like that is, yes, the existence of void allows us to explain how things move. But I think this sentence is going far beyond that. And it's important for us to talk about what it is asserting. What do you read that sentence to assert?
What I read that sentence to assert is that there is nothing besides atoms and void. That's all there is. Atoms and void and nothing else. This was said to be a mantra among Epicureans. I don't know if that's true or not, but atoms and void and nothing else.
I'm not familiar with that assertion. Do you remember where you read that?
It's in Stephen Greenblatt, this word.
Okay.
Which might, I think a lot of the claims that are made both by Greenblatt and DeWitt about the practices of the early Epicureans should probably be taken with a grain of salt. But
it's somewhat speculative, yeah. But I think that's accurate, though. Atoms and void and nothing else would be a good way to summarize it. And that nothing else is really extremely important. Before we go further, Martin, what do you think? Any initial reaction to that sentence?
Yeah, I have nothing to add at this point.
Because it's not really a physics sentence. It's more of a logical assertion, it seems to me. Because, of course, it is something when you're talking about nothing can even be thought of by conception or analogy, you're almost by definition talking about something that is imperceptible. So, therefore, we're talking about imperceptible things and whether they exist or not. And when you start talking about imperceptible things, you're pretty much in the realm of logical assertions. Or are you, Joshua? I think you are, but go ahead. Let's talk about this.
One of the problems with life in general is that it's not possible to prove a negative. For example, it's not possible to prove that X doesn't exist. But what you can say, I think, with reason, is that if X did exist, it would leave certain fingerprints on the universe. And since we don't perceive those signs, then we can conclude that X does not exist. But Epicurus is almost going even farther than that and saying nothing can even be thought of either by conception or on the analogy of things conceivable. And he goes on, but he's making a very, very clear line here. You've got atoms, you've got void, and there's nothing beyond that.
What is he saying, Joshua? I almost laughed when he said he's drawing a very clear line here because there's a lot of aspects of this that are not particularly clear to me. What is he saying in this sentence? Other than what you just said a minute ago when you summarized it as matter and void and nothing else, I think that is definitely a takeaway from the sentence. But it's a much longer sentence than that. Why is he using so many words? What are these words saying?
Well, the thing that he knows is that immediately when he says there's atoms and void and nothing else, somebody's going to come up and say, well, there's love too. What about love? Does love not matter to you? Okay. When he says that there's atoms and void and nothing else, he's talking about what he calls whole existences. Atoms and void are whole existences. They exist in themselves and they are irreducible beyond atoms and void. Everything else that you think exists is actually just a property or an accident, or another word is eventum, of the mingling of atoms and void. Or how we would say it today would be maybe a particular configuration of matter and energy. And so something like mind, which for many other people and for other philosophers in Epicurus's time, mind is something that seems to have an independent existence, an incorporeal existence. But for Epicurus, there is no incorporeal existence other than void. That's the only thing that exists that doesn't have a physical property because it's just space.
I think you did a really good job with that. So keep going if you have something more to add.
Well, I don't have much more to add.
Okay. I was going to say, by focusing on those two words, whole existences, as the sort of starting point, I think that's really important. I think you're right. Okay, and so I do think it's very clear in Lucretius that when he starts talking about accidents or properties, I think he's talking about two separate things. The word accidents is the one in the Latin is eventum, but then there's the properties is something else. And if we were to go into Lucretius, we might want to do that at some point. The qualities and the properties are the two categories that Lucretius talks about, and maybe even Epicurus talks further about here in this letter. Properties of atoms are things that are unchangeable over time, and there's a few of them like shape and size and weight, and there may be one or two more, but that may be the whole list. But the eventum or the accidents or the qualities are those things that change according to context, such as color, according to the light that you're in.
Cassius, do you have a sense? I gather that there was some slight disagreement between Epicurus and Democritus as to the atoms and their characteristics, but I don't have a good handle on it. But there is this famous quote by Democritus. It says, "By convention sweet and by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, but in reality, atoms and void, and nothing else." So this is what we mean when we talk about, I guess some of these you might consider to be accidents, and some of these you might be considered to be properties. But this is a short list of things that are not whole existences.
I hope we can get that in the show notes, Joshua, that quote that you just read. I think that is consistent across Epicurus and Democritus, but when the way you read it and the wording in English there, when it says in reality only atoms and void, I think that's the word that causes all the confusion, because I think that Epicurus would certainly stress that these conventions are real to us in a sense anyway. They're not just speculation. They're not just whims. They're not just assertions. They really are things that our senses perceive. And there is no reality other than what our senses perceive. It would be, I think, something Epicurus would argue. So,
Frances Wright, in her book, she has Epicurus say something to the effect of, that is real to us, which is real to our senses.
Yes. I think that's Epicurus's point. Now, I don't want to say that it's not Democritus's point, because I don't know all the detail about Democritus, but I think you have to reach the conclusion that sensation is everything. Death is nothing to us because it's the absence of sensation. So that means life is sensation if you take the reverse. And so our reality is nothing but those things we can perceive. If we can't perceive it, it's unreal. So the idea that the reality that we live in is, this goes back into all this issue of meaningfulness and so forth, but the idea that what we see is meaningless and the only thing that has meaning is atoms and void, that's not Epicurus's point, I don't think. Yes, only atoms and void have eternal existence that does not change, but who cares about eternal existences that don't change? I'm alive right now. We're alive for 75 years or whatever, and what's going to happen after we die and before we were born certainly has relevance to us in a sense, but only those things that exist while we're alive enter into our own existences. We don't have an eternal soul that existed before we were born or that will exist after we die in Epicurean terms. So our reality is what our senses allow us to perceive. So that's the only reason I would question that formulation there. The convention part of it, maybe I quibble with that too. Convention implies to me that it's there because we agree on it. Well, I don't know. It's not there because we agree on it. It's there because my senses tell me that it's there. The word we use to describe it, a color, is convention, but what we perceive as the color of something doesn't matter how many people tell us, whether they agree with it or not. It's what our senses tell us. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Oh, no, I think that's all fair. One thing I should point out is that Democritus held that because the motion of atoms and void was mechanistic, that there was no free will, right? Because
absolutely.
Yeah.
That issue of the swerve is the big distinguishing factor that I've always read between Democritus and Epicurus. And that's where Cicero says something to the effect that all of Epicurus's science came from Democritus except the parts that he changed, and those parts that he changed is where he went wrong or something like that. The swerve is the main thing that he changed, supposedly.
Right. So actually, you mentioned Cicero, and we've been talking a lot today about how the Epicurean conception of cosmology is, I don't know if I want to use the word democratic, but it's in contrast to Pythagoras and Plato, those two in particular, but also, for example, the Catholic Church, as I mentioned. In contrast to those, the Epicurean system of cosmology and of sense perception is such that it is immediately available to everyone without any distinction at all. And I think Cicero has something to say about that. He says, and you've got this on the homepage to the EpicureanFriends.com forum. He says, "You Epicureans round up people from all the crossroads. Decent men, I allow, but certainly of no great education. Do such as they, then, comprehend what Epicurus means, while I, Cicero, do not." So I don't think we should discount, we've mentioned it several times, but there is an elitism about how people interact with the universe itself, and whether you need to go through an intermediary, whether that intermediary be a sage or a philosopher like Plato, whether it be a church leader like the Pope, or anything in between. But your ability to interface directly with the substance of the universe, even though it's imperceptible to you, is, I think, it's a great equalizer.
Because we don't have a video podcast, you can't see me nodding my head so strongly while you're talking there, because I agree completely with what you've just said. It's one of the more attractive resulting conclusions, I think, that come from this. But the conclusion doesn't arise, though, because it's attractive. The conclusion arises because it's the nature of perception and the nature of the science that Epicurus holds, that perception is the ultimate test of reality. And perception is what everybody has. So you end up with the conclusion that what you just said, you don't look for an intermediary. I mean, you look for people who are smarter than you to help you learn things faster, as you grow up, to teachers and so forth who will expose you to new things more efficiently than you could if you just were trying to learn everything new on your own. But in the end, it's this faculty of perception that is common to living things, common to humans, that is our ultimate standard. And there's no divine being who is selecting out a particular chosen group of people to have the truth. And it's also not any kind of Pythagorean mathematical incantations or symbolism that gives you access to some other dimension. Reality is as nature created it, a very, democratic is maybe the wrong word in the sense that we don't vote on what reality is. We all have access to it. I don't know what the right social structure would be to encompass that. Martin?
The idea is egalitarian.
Egalitarian. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we're at a pretty high level right this second talking about egalitarianism, and then the very next sentence goes back down to the among bodies, some are compounds and others are those of which compounds are formed. And then we start talking about indivisibility. We're probably close enough to the end of a normal podcast episode that rather than go on further, we probably ought to think about what we've been talking about today and see if there's anything else we want to say before we launch further into some more raw physics. Because, again, to beat the horse even more dead than he already is, these issues of epistemology are critical to Epicurean philosophy. And it's easy to gloss over them and easy to just move on and consider the discussion of physics. The discussion of epistemology is embedded in this discussion of the physics, which is something that Diogenes Laertius points out that the Epicureans did as a matter of course. They would talk about the physics and the method of thought at the same time. And it makes sense to do that. But perhaps for some of us today, it can cause us to gloss over the distinct issues that are involved in how do you reason and what is the nature of knowledge versus just the physics points.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking about, we were talking about how, knowledge is filtered through other people. And it's interesting to note those interesting times in history when the leader of orthodoxy, or the person who holds an absolute hold on the truth, where it sort of changes overnight. And I think that Constantine at the end of the Roman Empire was one of these people. And I didn't know this, but there's a story that Constantine It is known that Constantine killed his son and his wife, but
Before he converted to Christianity or afterwards?
Before he converted to Christianity. And the argument here goes that after he killed his wife and son, he went to some pagan priests or thinkers or whoever, elders, and asked for absolution, and they refused him. And then he went to the Christians and asked for absolution, and they granted it to him, and so he converted to Christianity.
That would be a different story than that he won some particular battle because he saw a cross in the sky or something, right?
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know how that bears too much on what we're talking about, but certainly if you see a cross in the sky, that's an indication that atoms and void are doing what they do. And tomorrow you'll go out and see a rubber duck in the sky, and it still won't mean anything because it's just nature.
Well, presumably there you're talking about cloud formations, but I would double down on Epicurus. I think Epicurus would tell us that if we see a duck in the sky in some huge object that's clearly a duck of momentous size, or if we saw some person descending with a cross in their hands from the middle of the sky, we ought to be careful about how we interpret it so that we're not manipulated or taken by some kind of illusion. But if in fact something like that were to happen, we would have to revise a lot of our thought processes, because ultimately the perceptions of the senses are what we have to deal with. We wouldn't take something like that at first glance and without a lot of questioning and without a lot of testing to determine if it is real. But, if that thing does happen in the sky and we determine through the senses that it has really happened, then we better deal with it. We may think that flying saucers are the creations of crazy people who want out-of-body experiences and want to get on television and talk about it. But if a flying saucer really does land in our front yard and it's not something that came from Area 56 or Area 57 and some CIA project, then we better Area 51. Then that's how we determine what reality is what happens to us has to be given ultimate authority. And Joshua, I know you have a better story to illustrate what I've just said, but I think that is the truth, right? Ultimately, what we perceive
in
trumps
terms of
our expectations.
Right, yeah.
We've all seen all these different science fiction movies with big, huge spaceships landing on Earth, and we expect that not to happen based on our science right now and our knowledge of the universe. But if a spaceship does land on top of the White House next year and they're clearly not from Earth, then it's time for us to incorporate that into our knowledge of the universe. No matter how much our expectations have told us that it's not going to happen, if it in fact does happen, it has to be incorporated. The point is that the ultimate test of reality is not our logical speculations about reality, but what we can perceive in our existence. How would you say that, Martin?
Yeah, that's what you said. Currently I wouldn't say it any differently.
There's a huge line here between we just don't expect that the world's going to end tomorrow because okay, maybe it will. We don't accept everything that we imagine as possible. We don't accept as likely to happen. But ultimately, we sort everything out according to the evidence of our senses.
That seems to me to be the key thing here, is that every time we get up to this higher level understanding of what's going on, and then we go on to the next line in Epicurus's letter, it always just rivets us right back down, not only down to earth, but down to the nuts and bolts of the universe, which are atoms and void.
But wait a minute. Does it rivet us down to atoms and void, which are imperceptible, or does it rivet us down to you'd better have confidence in your senses to do your reasoning about everything? I don't mean to be.
What you're saying, yeah.
Okay.
I think to a sense it's both. But what I'm driving at here is, if it turns out that the universe throws something at us that we didn't imagine, it might well be the case that we could have imagined it, given what we already knew.
Right. And I think you used the word both a minute ago. And that's why they combine physics and epistemology and discuss it at the same time. Because you need not only a method in terms of relying on your senses, but you also have to reach some conclusions about the nature of the universe in terms of atoms and void and everything else. They go together, which makes it logical to talk about them together. All right, we got to come to a more firm conclusion for the ending of the episode, Joshua. And maybe the ending needs to come from this point about how they go together. How can you discuss why it's so logical to combine physics and epistemology?
I think it's essential to combine physics and epistemology because each one provides a check against the other, in a sense. By having both in hand, what it really prevents is it prevents you from going off on a wild flight of whimsy detached from any sense of reality, because you need to have a sense, at least a sense of what there is in the universe and how the universe works. But you also have to constantly attend to the other part of the equation, which is how is it that you think you know what the universe is and how it works? And if you go too far down the direction of just saying what's in the universe, but not attending to how your knowledge of that is formed or where it comes from, which is from the senses, you can end up with a picture that doesn't really resemble the way things really are. But the reverse is true as well. If you spend too long on the second half of the equation, which is constantly being skeptical of how it is that you know what you know, then you end up with the position of Pyrrho, which is that nothing is knowable, or the position of Heraclitus, which is that we cannot get to anything like true knowledge. True knowledge, I hate it when I slip into a phrase I instantly regret. But I think you know what I'm driving at here, though. It's that it's important to be, I'm going to use the word skeptical to a degree about what we think we know about the universe. And the way we do that is we restrain ourselves to the evidence of our senses and reason, which we use to expand beyond the evidence of our senses within a certain amount of restraint. And then there's the universe itself, which we're trying to understand, but we're never going to understand if we can't get the sense perception part right. I'm going to invite Cassius to speak now. And Martin.
I'm going to largely agree with you. Martin?
I have nothing to add.
Okay. Yeah, Joshua, I think what you've just said is correct. And, I realize it sounds like we're struggling here, but I'm pleased with this conversation, even though we're struggling through it. I don't think anybody, at least certainly me, I don't represent that I've got all this figured out, that I understand Epicurus. I think that people listening to this discussion, me listening to you discuss it, it's very helpful to me to try to piece it together in my mind and think about what the answers are when we seem to be hesitating and why we're hesitating and how we can improve our understanding of that particular aspect of it. Because again, I think this is an area that we really need to put more time in being able to explain to other people. So even though we struggle through some of this today, I think it's very valuable to do this. And as we continue on next week, we'll come back and continue to hit some of these same things. We really need to be firm about what our position is on the role of the senses in Epicurean philosophy. And we also need to be able to firmly articulate what we think is different between Epicurus' approach and the approach of these other philosophers. Maybe there are nuances, maybe there are dramatic differences, but if we're not confident in the way that we explain those, then that tells me that we're not as far along in our understanding as we ought to be ourselves. So I think this is very valuable to do what we're doing right now. And the fact that we are struggling through it just gives us signs in which directions we need to spend more time and more research. So we'll have plenty of opportunity to revisit these very same issues over the next couple of weeks as we go further, because they do seem to underlay everything that we're talking about. And there's probably some more material in Lucretius we can refer to for explanation. And I don't know that we'll go ahead and pull out any of the commentary in Philodemus's On Signs that's out there as well. But there's plenty of material to develop here. And hopefully the podcast will spur us on to put more effort into it. So unless anybody has any closing thoughts, I think we've been closing for a while now. Joshua, I suspect Martin doesn't have anything further to add. Joshua, do you?
I am hesitant to say anything that will lead us right back into the problem. There will be plenty of time for that next week.
Okay.
For me to put my foot in it.
Okay. Well, very good. I appreciate the time that you guys give as we produce this podcast. I think it's very helpful, and we will come back and continue next week. So thanks very much. See you then.
Thanks.
Bye.